Pronunciation of vowels and diphthongs from Elucidations of the Student's Greek Grammar by Georg Curtius. Read for the Librivox Learning Collection, Volume 3. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Pronunciation of the vowels and diphthongs. I have treated the pronunciation of vowels and diphthongs at length in Zeitschrift für die österreichischen Gymnasien, 1852, page 1 and the following. This difficult question is often placed in an entirely false light by restricting it to the alternatives of modern Greek pronunciation on the one hand, and the Erasmian pronunciation with its numerous errors and corruptions on the other. It is better to put the question thus: how early do we find traces of the modern Greek method of pronunciation? At the same time, we must be careful not to take all the sounds together, but to examine each separately. The modern Greeks have, it may almost be said, entirely reversed the quantity of the vowels, and to a certain extent of the diphthongs also. To follow them in pronouncing echei like echi would render useless every attempt to make the ancient verses tolerable to the ear, and anyone who, like them, pronounces epsilon ypsilon as oi can form no intelligible conception of a verse like Odyssey 5:19, Pheron de Euenora chalkon. Nor can he understand why forms like pepaideuntai were possible, while others like tetypentai were avoided. With regard to the diphthongs, we have fixed terminus a quo in opposition to the terminus ad quem of modern Greek. As a rule, the history of these sounds begins with the distinct pronunciation of both the elements. In Greek, as in many other languages, it ends with compressing numerous double sounds into single ones. That the real diphthongal pronunciation of I, oi, ei was the oldest is the more certain because in Greek itself we find each of these double sounds proceeding from the amalgamation of the two elements, that is, in pais, compared with the Homeric pais, ois from Homeric ois, tereina from terenia. Equally certain is that even at a very early period the diphthongal pronunciation began to be lost. The only question is, how early did this take place? Was it so early that the diphthongal pronunciation was quite unknown in the works of the best period, or, on the other hand, so late that in using the monophthongal pronunciation we introduce an element of corruption into a period in which it had no place? Since there are good reasons for selecting one particular period, which can hardly be any other than the Attic, and since it would be very ridiculous in practice to have a separate Homeric and Attic pronunciation, the Attic age must necessarily be our standard. Within this period, which in round numbers reaches from 500 BC to 300 BC, the year 400 BC may fairly be chosen as a fixed point, not merely because it is halfway between the two limits, but because the new alphabet, made public in 401 BC, offers at least some footing in regard to the sound of the letters. In many languages, it is true, letters are retained from an old alphabet which in no way correspond to the existing sounds. But if an innovation in orthography becomes current, it is a priori probable that it is on the whole in close connection with the existing language. It is very improbable that the epsilon iota of the older alphabet began to be divided into epsilon iota and eta iota by public edict at a time when the distinction between the pronunciation of the two sounds was already obliterated, or that the new eta would have been introduced if the iota, which had already been long in existence, could have supplied its place. On the contrary, we may naturally suppose that the sound represented by eta was at that time such that it required a separate symbol, and that on the whole the new alphabet has handed down to us a picture of the language as it was spoken in Attica at the time when the alphabet was made public. Many difficulties, it is true, still remain. In many cases we cannot exactly prove how early the older pronunciation began to be laid aside. It is certain that alpha iota and epsilon iota were the first to change, and that as early as the Alexandrian period they were pronounced in some districts as ä and I. But it can hardly be proved that this corruption began as early as the Attic period. Perhaps, without being too bold, we may connect it with the violent changes which the Greek would underwent after Alexander. The mutual confusion of the different Greek races, the supremacy of the semi-barbarian Macedonians, the manifold contact with non-Greek and especially Oriental nations, could not be without an influence on the sound of the language. There is nothing whatever to prove that the corruption existed earlier, and as it is an advantage, from a practical point of view, to draw distinctions wherever sufficient data for them are to be found, the rule laid down in section 8 with regard to the pronunciation of diphthongs, that both elements should receive their proper value, as far as possible, may in general be recommended with certainty. Remark: if anyone considers this impossible, I advise him to request a Bohemian schoolmaster to pronounce the diphthongs. There, and as I believe in Austria generally, where owing to the intersection of different nations and stocks, the vocal organs are more pliable, this rule is fully carried out, whereas in other provinces of German civilization the greatest mistakes have crept in. End of remark. Alpha iota, therefore, is not to be confounded with eta. Gottfried Hermann, De Emendanda Ratione Grammaticae Graecae, page 51, recommends a pronunciation midway between a and e, sharper than ä. This advice has not been followed in Germany, but eta in alpha iota, for example in mnämon and daimon, are still pronounced the same. In any case, those who render alpha iota by ä must also render epsilon iota by I, for there is no probability whatever that corruption set in earlier in the one case than in the other. It is useless to appeal to the Latin transcription in support of this pronunciation, because it is certain that ai, the Latin representative of Greek alpha iota, which was originally written and without any doubt pronounced as a diphthong, was carefully distinguished from I by educated Romans even down to Varro's time. Corson, Aussprache des Lateinischen 1, 194. The monophthongal pronunciation of alpha iota has at least the authority of the later Greeks from Alexandrian times, and of many scholars. but the ordinary pronunciation of epsilon iota as a broad German I is quite absurd and utterly baseless. In German, I is in sound undistinguishable from I. Weiser, for instance, rhymes with Kaiser. See Rumpelt, Deutsche Grammatik 1, page 36. And therefore it evidently contains the elements of A and I. But in regard to the Greek epsilon iota, there is not the slightest probability either from the origin of the diphthong, which arises out of epsilon and iota, or from the transliteration of the Latins, who sometimes used I, sometimes I, or from the sharpening into I which began to be common from 300 to 200 BC, that the alpha sound was ever heard, or that epsilon iota and alpha iota had the same sound, or that epsilon iota was pronounced as alpha iota while alpha iota became ä. We may maintain with the greatest certainty that einai or einä never represented the sound of the Greek einai. Gottfried Hermann saw this. De emendanda ratione, page 53, he says, diphthongum ei male pronunciari plena voce, ut Germanicum ai aut Britannorum ai longum, vel Latina lingua docere potest, quae istam diphthongum nunc in e nunc in I mutat. Ex quibus merito colligi videtur diphthongi ei sonum fuisse medium inter epsilon et iota, eodem modo, ut in quibusdam Germaniae regionibus ai pronunciatur. Remark: in Swabia on the lower Rhine, for example, in the word Rhein, and in northwest of Moravia, and probably in many other districts of Germany also, a real diphthong a occurs, clearly distinguished from I, in such a manner that I and E are distinctly perceived. It is no very difficult experiment to accustom the young pupil to this sound. End of remark. If there is little reason to follow the modern Greeks in the pronunciation of alpha iota and epsilon iota, there is obviously even less reason still to follow them in pronouncing omicron iota as I. Nothing is more certain that omicron iota became sharpened into I farther later than epsilon iota or even eta. Liscovius, in his tract on Greek pronunciation, Leipzig 1825, which contains much that is still useful, refers, page 140, to the various orthographical rules which have come down to us from the old grammarians. He mentions the erotemata of Basilius Magnus, page 594, 4th century after Christ, where among other rules the following occurs: Pars alexis aputes q syllabes archomenae dia tu y graphetae plen tu koilon. The rule would be false if q were pronounced like ki, because in that case exceptions like kitaris, kis, kisos, kechano, kion, and many others ought to have been quoted. Similarly, in the epimerismata, which have come down to us under the name of Herodian, and in the etymologists, for example, Etymologicum Magnum, page 289, 11, ta eis yx hapanta dia tu ypsilo graphetae plen tu proix. This case is especially instructive on account of the great number of words in iota xi. R. J. A. Schmidt has collected a great number of such facts in his Beiträge zur Geschichte der Grammatik, page 73 and the following, and deduces from them an explanation, undoubtedly correct, of the terms epsilon and ypsilon, that is, that psilon here means bear, in opposition to the diphthongal method of writing alpha iota and omicron iota. For this reason also, these terms first arose at a time when epsilon, hitherto named a, and ypsilon, hitherto y, were no longer distinct in pronunciation from alpha iota and omicron iota. Schmidt rightly refers to the alphabetical arrangement in Suidas to the same principle. Isolated instances of a similar arrangement are found also in the Etymologicum Magnum. Doidyx, for instance, stands after dryphactos, and then after a number of words beginning with doi follows duo. Although rules and usages of this kind were transferred from older collections into these later ones, it is not likely that they were borrowed without any alterations, unless at the time when the Etymologicum Magnum was compiled, that is, as is commonly supposed, in the 11th century. Omicron iota was regarded as phonetically identical with ypsilon, but as distinct from iota, epsilon iota, eta, which at that time were one and the same sound. Such being the state of the case, two results follow. 1. Those who pronounce ypsilon as iota follow a system of pronunciation which certainly did not exist in the 4th and probably not in the 11th century AD. 2. That it is a great mistake to conclude from the Latin transliteration of omicron iota by OI that omicron iota had the sound of a German Ö, as K. W. Krüger, among others, maintains, section 44, A1. Omicron iota in the 4th century AD was pronounced as ypsilon. The latter, therefore, according to this theory, must also have been pronounced as Ö, which, in spite of certain mutual changes between the sounds, no one will maintain, and which is more conceivable because Quintilian, 12-10-27, expressly says that ypsilon sound was wanting in Latin. The Latin OE, the identity of which with the German Ö is by no means certain, like AI only represents the Greek omicron iota, because it is the successor of the older diphthong with I. When Oinomaus was written, Mommsen Corpus Inscriptionum number 60, both sounds of the diphthong were certainly pronounced, and if OI had been like German Ö, it could hardly have given rise to U, oitir, uti, poena, punio. The history of the Greek omicron iota is therefore as follows. At the time of the general corruption of the diphthongs, it passed into Ü, and then by a later change into I. All these deteriorations of the diphthongs meet us first in the Boeotian dialect, which even in classical time replaced alpha iota with eta, epsilon iota with iota, and omicron iota with ypsilon. Opheilete, imi, thys, Arens, Aeolica, 191. Besides, even in modern Greek, acute observers find delicate distinctions between the several iota sounds, and quite unmistakably remains of older sounds in several words. Thiersch, Griechische Grammatik, 4th edition, Section 7 Remark Ernst Curtius, Göttingischer Anzeiger, Nachrichten, 1857, number 22. A further objection to the itacistic method of pronunciation, which reduces all to one level. As distinguished from Omicron iota, which in sound was not far removed from the English oi, epsilon y must be pronounced so that the sharper epsilon may be heard before the ypsilon. This is the regular pronunciation of the German oi in Mecklenburg, whereas the common mode of pronouncing this diphthong identifies it with oi or even with ai. The Bacchic exclamation aioi may serve as a warning against the confusion of epsilon iota and omicron iota. Aiei and zöiei against the confusion of alpha iota and epsilon iota, epsilon y and epsilon iota. Two main proofs may be cited of the strict monophthongal pronunciation of omicron y. 1. In the Boyottian dialect, omicron y represents even the short u sound, for example, cunes. Second, the Latin never made the attempt to write this obviously merely graphical diphthong with two letters, although it would have been very easy for them, having in earlier times the diphthong o, to do so. It is true that omicron y in certain cases corresponds etymologically to a diphthong, for example, bus is Sanskrit gaus. Yet the sound must have been simple at a very early period, and only when the letter y became fixed for ü, were the Greeks, like the French in modern times, compelled to denote the simple vowel by combining the symbols of the sounds, which to some extent denote the limits between which the vowel in question lay. In opia fecerunt, says even Nicridius Figulus in Aulius Gellius, Noctes Atticae, 1914. That E subscriptum had ceased to be sounded as early as Strabo's time, contemporary with Augustus, is clear from 14, page 648. Inscriptions belonging to a period even earlier present considerable variation in writing or omitting it, though it may have been sound in the best period, but it would be difficult to express it with our northern organs of speech. End of Pronunciation of Vowels and Diphthongs by Georg Curtius.